Hello and welcome, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of A Tale of Thought and Technics. This is intended to be a cozy series. That's why I've got a cozy background, but not a simple one in terms of the topics we're going to be discussing. And you can imagine this to be a kind of tale through history, a series that will start in early historical times and guide us through history, but it's not about historical events per se. So we will be branching out into many different areas and many different developments that happened historically, but focus on sciences, on technologies, on the general development of humanity as a species and our minds and our ideas and our inventions. I will be following the guidance of Arnold Toynbee's Mankind and Mother Earth, where I won't be really lecturing on this book itself, but it is kind of the guiding factor that guides me through what topics we will be touching upon. But I'll be branching out on to a lot of different thinkers, and that is what is going to make it exciting. And it's always difficult to know where to begin with these kind of lectures, these kinds of topics, which is why I decided to start off talking about how to study history, how to understand history as a process, and what kind of analyses there have been about how to predict historical developments, look at particular regularities and patterns and cycles that seem to be common to most, if not all, human societies, human civilizations. So, beginning today with psychohistory and cliodynamics, or cliodynamics. I'm actually not sure how you pronounce it, but this will be the starting point because this will start off with a general perspective on studying historical dynamics. Moving on from this, we will be speaking about areas such as the biosphere, the prehistory, the kind of cosmological, physical, and chemical prehistory of our world before we came to what we know as human history, what we have within historical records. But today we're starting off with what it means to study history as a science of complex systems, as a science of complex system dynamics. So, what is psychohistory and what is cliodynamics? This is a bit of a trick question because psychohistory as such does not really exist. It is a fictional science, a science that was invented by Isaac Asimov in his science fiction novel Foundation. There's the Foundation series. And just to give a quick overview, the idea behind Foundation is that there is a galactic empire that is on the brink of collapse, and a scientist named Harry Seldon, who is a scientist in psychohistory, studies the general cycles of history. And something that is important to note that does actually apply in general to complex systems is that it is almost impossible to predict individual events within complex systems, but it is very much possible to predict long-term general evolutions of the system. So, whilst he cannot pin down what events exactly will lead to the decline and collapse of the galactic empire, he can predict its general eventual collapse. And what he then proposes is that he starts a foundation, that he gets funding by the Galactic Emperor for a foundation, a planet that focuses on retrieving and preserving all of the knowledge, the technology, the thought that was developed in that galactic empire, and thus be the seed for the next empire and reduce the Dark Ages, or the phase, the interim period post collapse of the empire, reduce it down to only a couple of thousand years, which otherwise would be tens of thousands of years if there was no such thing as that foundation. So the interesting thing with complex systems is that they often have cybernetic feedback effects, meaning that even the observation and the acquisition of information on that system can lead to a change of that system itself and to an eventual failure of that theory to describe that system. For example, once you have a certain information about the stock market, which is a complex system, you may no longer be able to exploit that information. Once that information is out, the exploitation of that information leads to a change of the dynamics of the stock market, and that information no longer applies, it expires, so to say. So the biggest threat basically to psychohistory, to the prediction of history, is other psychohistorians making similar predictions and acting accordingly. So what if other psychohistorians started a foundation? Potentially the first foundation's theories about the development of the Galactic Empire no longer apply, must be changed. So the interesting thing is that Harry Seldon, the professor for psychohistory, he actually forms the foundation and then abolishes the field of psychohistory so that he kind of becomes the last psychohistorian. The foundation revives all of the knowledge and all of the sciences of the Galactic Empire, but actually does not engage in psychohistory directly, so that the long-term plans of Harry Seldon, which last thousands of years, which are planned ahead thousands of years, if not tens of thousands, still apply and still work, and thus capture the cycles and step in at the right times when certain cycles are predicted to end. And that is one of the core points, is the idea of cycles within history. We have that from many thinkers, most notably Oswald Spengler and Arnold Toynbee, which is also one of the many reasons why the guiding work for this series is Toynbee's Mankind and Mother Earth. In general terms, one could roughly say that whilst Spengler was influenced by Nietzsche for his views, for his philosophical underpinnings, for his historiography, Toynbee was influenced by Carl Jung. And I'm a fan of both Nietzsche and Jung, so you can choose which one you'd rather follow. So, coming back to the idea of psychohistory, I've got an article here on by Asimov's fans, describing psychohistory as the mathematical study of the reactions of human conglomerates in response to economic and social stimuli. Psychohistory was developed by Harry Seldon and expanded through the efforts of Gal Dornick and other mathematicians. Using psychohistory, Seldon predicted the fall of the Galactic Empire and developed Seldon's plan to shorten the interregnum. The interregnum being the phase, the dark age, in between civilizational cycles, in between empires, so to say. I'd like to focus a bit on what psychohistory could mean in the real world, as I've been focusing on it as a fictional science in a science fiction novel. And this is where we get to the idea of cliodynamics. So, cliodynamics engages in mathematical models for historical developments. So it is actually inspired by psychohistory, and it is a real discipline that is most popularly engaged in by Peter Turkhin. And so Peter Turkhin has multiple models he describes in his work Historical Dynamics, one of which is the geopolitical model, as you can see here, or a demographic model, as you can see here, and also something called the meta-ethnic frontier theory. So these can be seen as the three main ideas. To start a little earlier, he references a medieval Muslim sociologist. One could call him the first historiographer or sociologist that turned historiography and sociology into a science as we know it today, into something that resembles mathematical models of history. So you could see Ibn Khaldun as the father, as the founder of this kind of discipline, as the archetypal psychohistorian, so to say. And what Ibn Khaldun coined especially is a term that is used even today within, for example, Turkhan's theories, and that is the notion of asabiya. So asabiya is to be understood as the sense of oneness, of unity of a group. Asab means something like nerve. Asabiya is something like the spirit, the nerve of a people. It was something that was brought up in an article about the recent, or now 3 years past, fall of the American-funded government in Afghanistan by the Taliban. And it kind of explains the victory of the Taliban, which were technologically inferior to the United States. It explained it by having superior asabiya. The identity of the militias fighting the regime there was so tied to the land and was so willing to give up their life in defense or in their struggle for that land that really wasn't there with the American soldiers or the soldiers hired and trained by the American soldiers, which are mostly there for other geopolitical reasons or personal financial reasons, but could not bring up that kind of asabiya, that kind of identity and group spirit that the opposing side had. So regardless of the advantage of technology, it seemed that asabiya in the end dominated and determined the victor in that struggle. And it's interesting to bring in this new group identity term, asabiya, as opposed to nation or religion, because asabiya is an identity that can include both. It's not necessarily a purely ethnic identity. It's also not necessarily purely religious identity. It is just the notion of group identity in general that in general would be a mix of ethnic identities and religious identities, and rarely exclusively one or the other. And so let's have a look at the three main models that Peter Turkhan speaks about. So he speaks about, firstly, the meta-ethnic frontier theory. And that is the theory that once there is a frontier that represents a strong contrast between one side and the other side of the frontier in terms of ethnicity, once there is, for example, in the case of the Roman Empire, a strong contrast between the languages, the cultures, the ethnicities within the empire and the languages and cultures and ethnicities outside of the empire, you have a dynamic that activates asabiya, you could say. So basically this gradient of empire and non-empire, that distinction, that contrast is precisely what fuels asabiya. So that contrast, once it is further away of the empire, is not strong enough. You could say that the ethnicities are not confronted with such a large barrier, you could say, and thus the asabiyas, the identities, may dissipate quicker. They may dissipate and intermarry with other ethnicities and mix and syncretize religious identities. Yet, when it comes to meta-ethnic frontier, there seems to be some sort of clash happening. There seems to be some sort of barrier that really emphasizes on the difference. So You have an ethnicity across that barrier that really emphasizes its distinction from you and thus reflects back on your own identity. It brings you more to your authentic sense of who am I, and throws and confronts you and confronts any group with the question of its own identity much stronger, on top of obvious reasons such as real military threats coming from that meta ethnic frontier. And from here, I'd like to make a little detour to the work of Sir John Glubb. A very interesting short essay, 26 pages, not very widely known, called The Fate of Empires and Search for Survival, actually represents a kind of cliodynamic theory of what happens once Asabiya is activated at that meta-ethnic frontier. And you can skip right ahead to the summaries, where he speaks about the stages of the rise and fall of great nations. And so the first stage, which he refers to as the outburst, is what I just called the activation of Asabiya. So it is that which initiates a kind of energy, initiates a kind of radical expansion of that activated identity group. And that is the age of pioneers, the age in which there's a radical, rapid expansion of that people, of that population, onto a wider territory. After that, you get the age of conquests, which kind of has turned that expansion into routine, into a common practice of expanding its resources, expanding its influence, and then ultimately establishing markets and establishing a system, an infrastructure of accumulating wealth, which leads to the next stage, which is the age of commerce. The age of commerce, as there's obviously within that polity a dominating ethnicity, a dominating group, which is the group of the initial Asabiya. So, for example, the Persians and the Persian Empire were only one group of many that were ruling over the others. Same with the Arabs in the initial caliphates, such as the Umayyad caliphates. And thus, the infrastructure of commerce is structured in such a way that there is an accumulation of wealth, there is a siphoning off of wealth, a kind of geopolitical magnet that accumulates the wealth at the center and at the expense of the periphery, which leads then to an age of affluence, and something that then leads to what is commonly referred to as an age of decadence, or in this case, interestingly enough, an age of intellect. So that is something that I found particularly striking or interesting in Glubb's description, namely that what goes hand in hand with decadence is actually intellectualism. The scientific or rational study and reflection upon the empire is actually what weakens it. The age of affluence allows people to start engaging in intellectual activities and being less inclined to follow and pursue the path of the warrior, the path that was the most, or seen as the most virtuous in the initial stages of outburst and conquest. So the age of intellect, and arguably that's an age we are in now, whatever that means for our time, it would in this case mean that we are in a late stage, and ultimately the age of decadence, of ultimate decadence, where even the intellect is no longer capable of maintaining a system of study that has true merit to it, but it all degenerates into complete decadence. That represents the final stage, where decadence is marked by defensiveness, pessimism, materialism, interestingly enough, frivolity, an influx of foreigners, also interesting, welfare state, also interesting. And what is most fascinating about this is that Glubb even describes some of these developments in societies as old as the Abbasid Caliphate, as old as like the 8th or 9th century or 10th century in Iraq, There was situations where people were complaining about the rise of pop music, of popular music, even back then in the Abbasid Caliphate, that there was a kind of attitude of arrogance of educated folk, and a decline of virtues such as strength and humility and the kind of path of the warrior. So this as a little detour to the stages that are followed after the activation of Asabiya through this kind of meta-ethnic frontier situation, and moving on to the next theory that he speaks of, and that is the geopolitical model, which for some reason I took an image that's in Russian. Forgive me for this. So essentially what is happening here is you've got a controlled resource, what you can also call a territory size, the area, the total amount of resources that are under control by that empire. And expansion can be seen as something like war success. And so there's positive feedback loops, there's positive reinforcement factors, and there's negative reinforcement factors. One of the positive reinforcement factors of controlled resource is obviously the geopolitical resources that you can use to fund your wars, that feed back into war success and contribute to a better war success. The other one is logistic loads. Once the controlled resource becomes larger, the logistic complexity of managing the infrastructure to manage and process all of the resources into your warfare does in turn, however, have a negative effect on war success and expansion. A higher logistic load and complexity would at the same time lead to a lower capability of expanding and having war success. So the latter would be something like that he refers to as marchland position. However, that has not been fully explicated in a reliable way. Namely that the more controlled resource, the more controlled territory, the more territory an army would have to walk through, the more disadvantageous the marchland position is. And a better marchland position would lead to more expansion or more success in war efforts. So moving on to the third theory, we come to something called the demographic model, looking at the types of populations within a society, within the there we go. Yeah. Within the polity, within the political structure. So, first of all, Turkin is also a follower of the iron law of oligarchy theory, namely that there's always such a thing as an elite. That elite can obviously change its attributes. There's famous distinctions such as the distinctions by Wilfredo Pareto, where he distinguished between lions and foxes. Elites that rule based on dominance, and foxes, elites that rule based on professionalism, on expertise. You could see that distinction, for example, between the warrior caste, which were more lions, and the priesthood, which are more foxes. You can see a similar thing today where the foxes would be something like the managerial elite or academic elite, and foxes and lions in that sense don't really exist as much in the West, but you could see them as the lions as dictators, for example, as modern kind of autocrats you have throughout the rest of the world. And So the demographic models are strongest in their capability of introducing complexity and modeling more complex systems. However, the more variables and free variables you have in complex models, the less predictable power they will have, because a slight adjustment of one of the variables may change the predictive outcome very much, and the probability of having all of these variables fine-tuned correctly is pretty low. I personally once engaged in a kind of modeling project for atmospheric data, analyzing when there are so-called blocking phenomena in the atmosphere. And if I changed the height of the mountains in my simulation by 1 meter, then these blocking phenomena would just not occur at all. So the 1 meter height difference in 400-meter high mountains led to a completely different outcome in the model. So there's various properties for each aspect within the demographic model. You get the general population, their numbers, age structure, urbanization, relative wages, social optimism, and so on. You get similar attributes for the other properties within the state. And obviously, the elite question, the population question, always remain relevant. These are questions that are relevant in past civilizational cycles, but also in our current one. We have these problems that we know of, for example, as income inequality. We have problems such as demographic change. We have problems such as elite overproduction, a too high amount of people getting college degrees and too low amount of people learning trades and having performing skilled labor. So these are problems that are relevant topics today, all the time, and therefore they're, in a sense, they are timeless, and in a sense they can be applied to civilizations and political systems in the past. So these are not the only theories of cycles. Glob's theory and the geopolitic models that you can look at by Turkin and others. But we can go back further, and for anyone who's taken my course on the dynamics of power will be familiar with this, and that is going back to Plato's regimes. If anyone of you has not taken that course yet, I encourage you to get the self-study version of it. The link is in the description. There we go in depth into specifically Plato and Aristotle's description of the forms of government, but also much deeper into the philosophy of power and into other aspects such as sovereignty, such as control, propaganda, and different kinds of ways to study the topic of power, though we will be touching on some of them throughout the series for sure. Looking at Plato's regimes, we can see that there is a kind of descent. There is a kind of highest form of regime and a kind of necessary, inevitable descent into lower forms until you reach the ultimate lowest form, that is tyranny. He starts off with aristocracy, the most ideal aristocracy obviously being that of the rule of the philosopher kings, the rule of the most wise, those that are guided by their reason, by their appetite for eternal truth and wisdom, and then the decay into the timocracy. So there are three natural hierarchies in a society as Plato describes, and that is the highest order, that is the philosopher kings, the aristocrats. Then you get the guardians, that could be seen as something like a warrior caste, a warrior military class. And then you get the peasantry, the people, among which you can also make distinctions. Obviously, you can say you have the merchants and the craftsmen, and also then below that you would have slaves and others, and farmers, for example. So the highest form, and corresponding also to the highest part of the human soul, namely reason, is that of the aristocracy. The elite that is guided by reason is ruling the state. The next level of descent down into lower form is the timocracy, namely the rule of the warrior caste, or that part of the soul that strives for honor, that strives for virtue and honor. It is longer lasting than an individual life, but it is not as eternal as truth and wisdom. And then leading down to oligarchy, we've got the rule of the merchants, the rule of those who strive for money, for wealth, for material wealth, which is much shorter, which has a much shorter lifespan than virtue even. And of course an infinitely lower lifespan than truth and wisdom, which is eternal. Continuing on to the lowest form, as it's naturally unstable to have an oligarchy, as everyone will try and become part of the power structure to become wealthy, so the oligarchy expands until it is so parasitical that it collapses on itself and the state enters a state of universal plunder, where the people plunder the state for themselves, which is called democracy. So the general masses take control, enter one of the lowest stages, and that stage is essentially a stage of chaos that can only be reined in by a tyrant, leading up to a tyranny. So that tyranny either breaks down, leads to chaos, and leads to another tyrant, but eventually a tyrant will come up that is a benevolent tyrant, a tyrant that can establish an elite around himself that is guided by reason again, and the cycle may begin from anew, starting with an aristocracy. So the interesting aspect about all of these theories is that they have a kind of natural tendency of decay and decline incorporated in them. If you follow a kind of vitalistic, organic theory of life, such as the Nietzsche-inspired Spengler, then this can be compared to the life cycle of a human. Every human has a young, ambitious, motivated phase, and then enters other phases of his life until he becomes old and frail and eventually dies. And so you can make that analogy with a society, a civilization. However, one could look at it even more scientifically and speak of it as an entropic argument. So the famous second law of thermodynamics in physics claims that the general disorder measured by a measure called entropy, general entropy or disorder of a system may only increase but can never decrease. It may only remain constant or increase but never decrease. In other words, in more simpler terms, in terms of thermodynamics and heat, it means that heat only moves from the warmer to the cooler medium to create an equilibrium rather than the opposite. So if it's 3 degrees outside and it's 10 degrees inside, you cannot open the window and let the 3 degrees come in and add to your 10 degrees to make 13, but rather your room will cool down. So, or another way, if you have an ice cube in a glass of water, you have a kind of level of order there because the temperatures are separated. You have the cold temperatures localized in that particular cube and the warmer temperatures separated, sections or segmented off from that ice cube. With time, however, they will mix and you will have a kind of cooler general liquid in that glass. So the general state of disorder or entropy has increased. In a similar sense, you can imagine this kind of ice cube, this sectioned off high order, high level of order, to be the aristocracy, to be the initial organized and coordinated power structure, power elite. And with time, that power elite dilutes. It will include other people It would increase its membership numbers, which increases the chances for its general decay, increases the chances of people from slightly lower strata of society to become part of the elite. Until eventually you will have potentially the same amount of original philosopher king aristocrats, but a much higher amount of guardians in that elite. Thus, the guardians would be outnumbering the philosopher kings, leading to basically a democracy. So, interestingly enough, you kind of had already a sense of cliodynamics or psychohistory that already Plato engaged in over 2,000 years ago. And that is something to keep in mind, as this is a very new field of study scientifically, but actually seems to be a very old phenomenon to deal with. And the question obviously arises there, what represents a unit for a cycle? How long does a cycle take? So, for example, Glubb actually provides a number of slightly over 200 years. We do have empires that lasted longer than this, but he would consider them separate political cycles. For example, the early Roman Republic would be a separate cycle from the Roman Empire, which would be a separate cycle from the Christianized Roman Empire after that. Then the Eastern Roman Empire would be a separate cycle from the following Byzantine Empire. He also distinguishes cycles between an early Ottoman Empire and a later Ottoman Empire. There's also distinctions between an early Babylonian Empire, for example, the empires that long preceded the historical records that we know of, the very, very old civilizations around Ur and Sumer and Akkad and Assyria, and eventually the rise of Babylon as a city-state there with Hammurabi and the first code of law, and then the Neo-Babylonian Empire that is much more known due to the Bible with King Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar that are mentioned in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. So even if historical research denotes some of these empires with one name, there are multiple cycles. Egypt famously has an old, a middle, and a late empire. And in the same way, we can speak of subcycles. So each cycle may have a subcycle. There may be generational cycles within larger cycles. So there is a particular cycle potentially between the baby boomer generation leading up to the Gen Z generation now that represents one cycle, where the next generation or the one after may be again a kind of boom generation with a lot of children being born, for example. Yet all of them still being under the umbrella of modern Western civilization. So there's cycles and subcycles, and they are all embedded within each other. And this can be traced back philosophically on a deeper level to our sense of time. So each cycle is a duration, something that is indivisible, in itself a kind of pure archetypal form of time. Coined that term duration, obviously is much older, but understanding duration in that indivisible sense comes from Henri Bergson. And you can understand it in a sense that the modern scientific sense that time is infinitely divisible, or at least divisible based on some kind of uniform unit. That is a very new invention, a very derivative invention that was kicked off much earlier through the invention of the clock. However, the idea by which it started is the kind of conjunction of cycles. The idea of cycles within cycles is essentially the idea of our philosophical understanding of time itself. So if you have, for example, a cycle of the sun rising and the sun setting again, and then you have a cycle of the moon growing to the full moon and then declining, the receding again, then you have two cycles that you can compare. You can count the amount of cycles of day and night that pass until the cycle of the moon reoccurs again. So this kind of synthesis of embedded cycles and crossing over cycles is what allows us to understand time as a flow that passes through these cycles that you can distinguish as being different kinds of processes that take different amounts of time. This is what makes us recognize the durations by seeing them differ from each other. And in this, we have the original archetypal durations. And these archetypal durations are so deeply rooted. These archetypal durations are so deeply understood, for example, by early astrology, such as the great cycles of the great year with Plato, which I will be speaking about in the next episode, that they correlate with human cycles, not just human individual cycles, but also human civilizational cycles. So, as this series is called A Tale of Thought and Technics, there's also a question about what does technology represent in this? And this is the tricky question, as technology seems to be developing linearly. It doesn't seem to be something that disappears entirely with a cycle. It seems to recede at times. It seems to correlate somewhat, where there's a kind of technological regress after the fall of the old empire in Egypt, the new empire or middle empire architecture of ancient Egypt never achieved the kind of proficiency of architecture that the old empire had, or the fall of the Roman Empire, which led to the disappearance of aqueducts in Europe and the non-occurrence of a city with 1 million people or more than 1 million people until the rise of London. So there's a certain temporary retreat, but not a full completion or end of a cycle when it comes to technology. And so the question is whether technology represents the biggest cycle we can possibly imagine, a cycle so big that we cannot actually compare it to any duration, as that cycle has not ended yet, and the times before that cycle had begun, humans were not yet capable of holding historical records. Their historical record itself is something that requires technology, that requires at least the sophistication of language, written language, artifacts, and archaeology. And so it seems to be that the historical study is so entangled with that technological cycle that there seems to be a kind of pressing question posed by that idea. And you see that even in Spengler, whose main work is The Decline of the Occident, that speaks of civilizational cycles, but then he wrote a separate, shorter work called Man and Technics, in which he kind of compensates for the cyclical view by focusing on a more linear view of history, where he speaks about technology. So that is one of the texts that I recommend highly to read, based on the topics discussed here. Obviously, many works are very long and take a lot of effort to read, but for example, The Fate of Empires and Search for Survival by Sir John Glubb is only 26 pages. And also, that work by Spengler on Man and Technics is not too long either, and very much worth reading. So, to summarize, we've got various theories and models about historical dynamics, potentially reaching back to Plato, but explicitly having been formulated by Ibn Khaldun when he spoke of political identity and the dynamics of how political identity leads to an expansion of empire. He coined the term asabiya and focused on what asabiya as the group identity means for a people and means for its historical development. years before that, Plato already focused on forms of government, specifically the forms of government that decline from an initial benign aristocracy. But moving on to this, we've got the idea of psychohistory, the idea of a scientific study, a mathematical study, modellation of history by Asimov in his fantasy novel Foundation. This has translated into a real science or scientific field called cliodynamics. Cliodynamics, as coined by Peter Turkin, has various models to describe historical dynamics, some being more qualitative, some being more quantitative. There we've spoken about the meta-ethnic frontier theory, and also the geopolitical models and the demographic models. This has general implications for the idea of our history relating to technology. As technology represents something that cannot be grasped in cycles. But the focus is that there has been theories of cycles, such as the ones that I haven't mentioned so much here, like Oswald Spengler and Toynbee's, and that these cycles are rooted in our understanding of time from within cycles in the first place. Anyone who wants to get deeper into this mutual interrelationship or co-evolution or symbiotic reciprocal parasitism between our technological understanding of the world and technology's control of our human world, can check out my course on the machine, and which I've also published as a book. You can scan the QR code if you want to get that book. I recommend you to read it, and you can support my work by it and support me making these lectures series. So this is it for the first episode of A Tale of Thought and Technics. If you have any questions, write it in the comments, write it in the live chat, and I will see you in the next episode. Thank you very much.